lengthy chapter, although there's not much substance to it. The two main things that we can get out of this chapter, one of them obviously being Morris Shabalala, introduced as a character, and we learn about him and the fact that Tsotsi follows him. And the other one, a bit of a stretch, is there's a lot of emphasis here on dark versus light. And you can see already on the second page of the chapter I've identified dark, and a little bit later on light and things like that. So you'll remember the previous chapter, the gang was together except for Boston, of course, and Tsotsi said to Butcher and Diop, we're going to the city. And we say, well, what does that mean? Well, they've landed up at Terminal Place near the gasworks. Terminal obviously meaning end. If you have a terminal illness, you're going to die. So think of it as a dead end, and it can be a bus terminal or train terminal. So say now there's a bus, it comes here at the terminal, it will pick you up and then go in the direction that it came from, or alternatively drop you off and then return. Now at this terminal we hear about there are a lot of shops and a lot of beggars and homeless people and things like that. And of course Morris Shabalala is one of those beggars, and there's a reason for that which we obviously learn about. It talks about how by the time it is light, Terminal Place is alive, it's very busy. Many no longer look hopefully for the missing brother or husband or father. So that's what happens. That's the reality. A lot of men like Gumboot will go and work in the city, and then they will die. And of course the family doesn't know about it. They don't hear about it. He just never returns. And they're ever hopeful and look for him and things like that, but eventually they just give up. Of course we're getting into the night time, because naturally that's when the gang does their work, look for the shadows to get long, etc. And it'll be a Saturday night now. And it says here that night is never safe. Well, we know that, judging from the very first chapter where the mothers pull their sons and daughters inside the house when they see the gang walking along, because they know what the gang means. Gang waiting for the shadows to get longer, Suki's place situation, Gumboot being killed, etc. At 6:30 now in the evening, Tsotsi is by himself. Butcher and Diop they've left, they've split up. He doesn't know where they are, they don't know where he is, but he's quite happy to be on his own, and he's already found his victim. Talks about Morris Shabalala was also a man, so like Gumboot, a dignified man, has a sense of pride which we learn about. However, in his stature, in other words his height, he doesn't have that same characteristic of manliness, in a sense, because he doesn't have any legs, and he kind of uses his arms to drag himself along. Very important that for those of you who watch the movie, Morris Shabalala represented there is in like a kind of extended wheelchair kind of thing, with legs that don't kind of work. That is definitely not what we want to think about. We want to think about Morris Shabalala doesn't have legs and uses his hands to walk, maybe the wrong term, uses his hands to make his way through the streets and that. And of course it discusses all the blisters that he has on his hands, and how he can't really feel much on most parts of his hands, and how he has to put butter, or he used to put butter on the sores and pick out the gravel out the blisters and things like that. And it tells us here that he doesn't have much hope. How did he measure himself as a man? And that obviously creates a lot of bitterness in him, because he doesn't feel like he has that same respect, and he isn't able to work, and it annoys him. He doesn't like to take money. Don't try to bribe him with a penny. He wants to earn his money, and he tried to do that. It discusses how he used to try and say he could pull weeds out of the garden and things, and nobody really gave him a chance. So he's had no choice but to be a beggar essentially and take money, but it really hurts his pride. The first encounter that he has with Tsotsi is when Tsotsi stands on his hand, and it's not that it was painful that bothered him, but it was just the insult of, how can you see this man here, the struggling, this beggar, no legs, and actually stand on his hand. And of course Tsotsi doesn't apologize or anything like most people do. But that, he moves on from that, and he calls Tsotsi a couple of obscenities as we go, whelp of a yellow bitch and stuff like that. But it wasn't fear. Morris Shabalala admitted to having known fear only once. It wasn't fear that instilled in there because of Tsotsi. it tells us that the only time that he knew fear, and this is how he lost his legs, was in a mining accident. So he was obviously a miner, and the mine shaft collapsed and a giant beam fell on his legs. When they eventually found him, they lifted up the heavy beam that had fallen across his legs. Tsotsi, he said aloud, spat into the pavement. Morris Shabalala was on his way to the eating house. So that is where Morris Shabalala is going. He's been in Terminal Place all this time throughout the day, collecting pennies and coins and things like that. And now he's going to go and have supper at the Bantu eating house. Alright. We go on to page 60. Tells us how he moves. Turned out of the Terminal Place into the deserted street. Not too bothered, keeps on going. My hands are dying on me because of too much work in dragging me through the streets. 6 years they have worked now. Okay, so we discovered that he lost his legs 6 years ago. We can read on all about that. Halfway down the street when he stopped to rest, then he sees a man was sitting on the doorstep of a shop a little way down, scratching disinterestedly on the pavement with a matchstick. Now that is Tsotsi. Tsotsi is actually following him. But we don't really know why yet at this point. And in fact, I'm telling you it's Tsotsi, but perhaps we wouldn't know. Well, we wouldn't know until we found out a little bit later. Okay, so he's not too bothered though. Why do I go on? Does a bit of self-reflection. I'm not better than a dog. Interesting that he would use the comparison dog, and we can discuss it a little bit later. And slower, it was a recurring question in his life, naturally so. You feel sorry for this man, isn't able to work. Basically, he had the skills to be a miner, but he doesn't have the skills to actually do anything else. And so he's just living a life of small pennies that he collects every day and going to the eating house and that kind of thing. So it's a really tragic story. Another time he had asked himself, what is there to live for now? A sign of obviously lack of hope and faith and depression there. Without a doubt, we can understand why. When he stopped again, he was almost at the end of the street. Okay, then it talks about Terminal Place now was deserted. Everybody had gone home. Then he's moved on quite a bit, but Tsotsi has followed him, although stayed back always a little bit. So he turns around and he sees much nearer than the last time, so it's another shop in other words, Morris Shabalala, and sitting as he had sat earlier on the doorstep of a shop, scratching disinterestedly on the pavement with a matchstick, was the same man. So he sees Tsotsi again. At first he did not pay him any attention. Then Morris realized that there was something strange about him being there. Okay, he was the one who had tramped on his hand in Terminal Place. Okay, so this is the point where he realizes who the guy is. He dragged himself as quickly as he could to the crowded and well-lit main street of the city. Obviously, you've got less chance of getting mugged there if you are amongst other people and people can see you because it's light. Then I've kind of drawn a line here. So from 62 all the way here, all the way to 65, it's really just telling us mostly about Morris Shabalala and what he's had to do in his life, and the thoughts that he goes through, and the lady with the dog and things like that. The determination he had when he had left the hospital to survive as best he could was gone, and also his hope, even his desire to survive. Okay, we've been elaborating on that. He despised the money beside him that he had collected. He despised it because of the way of giving and because he hadn't worked for it. There's the pride coming in, and the people who got money they hadn't worked for were of a different breed from Morris Shabalala. Talks about how he had 9 shillings and 6 pence, how he counted it repeatedly to kind of keep himself busy. He realized he'd made a mistake in letting it accumulate. It was difficult to get rid of when there was so much. So Gumboot revealed his pay packet, now he knows that Tsotsi is kind of could be wanting to mug him and follow him because he's got this money. He's got a reasonably large sum of money, as money for begging goes. Page 65. But there was one part of him that starved until death, and that was his pride. Although he filled his life and mind with the word man, he doubted it, and this doubt had bred bitterness inwardly. Okay, so he doesn't like who he is. He doesn't like accepting money without working for it, etc. And of course there's that bitterness that we spoke about earlier. Then there's a newspaper seller on the corner of a street, and he's calling out the latest edition, sports results and things like that. A lot of people buying their papers. He talks to Morris, and Morris says, had he been a man, he would have taken sticks and beaten the little bastard to death. That's obviously Tsotsi is referring to. Instead, he had to crawl away like a frightened dog, and there's that mention of dog again, with his tail between his legs. And I've written here class, differentiation. He looked at the street and the big cars with their white passengers warm inside like wonderful presents in bright boxes, and the carefree, ugly crowds of the pavement, seeing them all with baleful feelings. It is for your gold that I had to dig. That is what destroyed me. You are walking on stolen legs, all of you. So again, that bitterness coming in there, and of course the whole class differentiation that came along with the apartheid era. Then he sees Tsotsi again. The man was standing in the doorway of a shop. Where there is light and people, I am safe. Where there is light, I am safe. Okay, in the literal sense, we obviously understand that. This world keeps its lights and people until late. He, in other words Tsotsi, can still lose patience or meet friends. He's hoping that he can get rid of Tsotsi, that eventually Tsotsi will stop following him because he'll meet up with friends, or a policeman will come around wanting to ask for his pass, and that'll make him run away. Please God, says Morris, let a policeman stop him and ask for his pass. Because even though he says it's not fear and all that, there at the beginning when he stood on his fan and stuff, Morris is now saying, you know what, actually I really wish Tsotsi would leave, stop following me, because of course he is scared. The small side street that would have brought him out near the eating house was an unanticipated and major problem. It was deserted and badly lit. In other words, he could get mugged, people wouldn't even see him, and there would be nobody to help him. Tsotsi still on the opposite side of the street, watching his victim. Morris knew that if he was caught in that street alone, it would be the end. He would either lose his money at best or die. There was a solution, of course, to leave the money at the first lamppost where it could be seen. He despised himself for this thought. He despised himself because he thinks, I'm not even prepared to fight for what is rightfully mine, that he has to surrender to another man. What choice does he really have? But at the same time, he thinks, well, Tsotsi probably wants my money, so if I leave the money, he'll hopefully take the money and go. Then it talks about an old decrepit car that came there, had kind of stalled, and it's got a couple of young white people in it, and that is Athol Fugard's way of kind of characterizing the stereotypical ignorant white person of the apartheid era, and they push the car, and then Morris Shabalala follows them down this alleyway because they are people, and he feels like that he can maybe stay safe with them. The side street that they pushed the car into led into another wide thoroughfare which ran diagonally away from the main street. Remember, all this is Morris's making his way to the Bantu eating house. Alright, there it is. Okay, that's where he's trying to get to. Pouring out ants like hurrying about the cows of broken heap in the Bantu eating house. So he arrives there, and he gets his food, and when that was finished, he crawled to the door and looked out into the street. He sees a lot of people. He doesn't see Tsotsi, so he thinks, okay, that's a good sign. He went back to the corner inside the Bantu eating house and ordered a mug of coffee. Morris finally confessed to himself, you were frightened. So it's when he's having his coffee there that he says to himself, actually, you know what, I was petrified out there with Tsotsi following me. You were frightened. You thought you had no fear, but tonight it was there, a small fear of death. I want to live. This is important. I put a star here because despite what we're hearing about his lack of hope and why does he even bother, he's just like a dog or things like that, here he says he does want to live. I didn't know it. I actually do want to be on the streets again tomorrow. I do want to be eating here again. What's left of me still wants to live. So he still has that fire in him. He still has that desire to live, which is good. Okay. Then the newspaper seller comes in and says, you dropped this penny and I tried to roll it to you and it just ran into the gutter and you didn't hear me, etc., etc. Then we hear about what Morris does with the money. He puts the penny away in a linen tobacco bag with his other money, and then told the man about the Tsotsi who had followed him. The newspaper seller says they're dogs, these Tsotsis. He said when Morris had finished, mad dogs, they bite their own people. So they murder their own people, they steal from their own people, and we saw that in earlier chapters with the gang and Gumboot Lamini. Then we get to the second last page. It talks about Morris finished what was left of his coffee, and then he went to the door. The street was almost empty. He could see no sign of the Tsotsi. So good thing, doesn't see Tsotsi. Bad thing that the street's almost empty. He has to go because the place is closing. I think it closes at 10 if I'm not mistaken. So he's in the street again. Vulnerable. To reach his present home, he had to slip down another side street and then along the loading bays of a factory. It was poorly lit. The lights were spaced at long intervals, the street lights, I suppose, and it was here that he realized that Tsotsi was behind him again. Unfortunately, Tsotsi is still there. He heard the footsteps and looking back saw him silhouetted in the light of one of the lamps. To reach the next light, Morris Shabalala had to crawl through a stretch of darkness. Yes, that's darkness, literal in that there is no light provided by the street light, but it also means that he has to, here's a light, here's a light. He has to enter that darkness, which also represents possible mugging, possible death, bad. Okay, so he feels like kind of safe here at the light, and darkness, whatever the darkness holds for him, and then the next light. All right. When he reached the light, he smothered his tears and paused for breath. Obviously out of breath because he's trying to move quickly on his hands there, and he's nervous, and his tears because he's scared. And then finding the brightest spot, he took out his money and held it high for the other one, Tsotsi, to see before putting it down. In other words, here's my money, now leave me alone. The young man, Tsotsi, walked up to the heap of coins and then kicked them flying into the darkness and came on after the cripple, who then started throwing stones. So Tsotsi obviously doesn't want the money, and Morris realizes that he's pretty good at throwing stones. His hands and his arms are pretty strong from using them to move around for 6 years. So he starts throwing stones. He's pretty accurate, but unfortunately Tsotsi just ducks them and moves out the way. Crawling forward after one such throw, Morris Shabalala looked back and could see him no more. He knew then that the young man was keeping to the shadows and darkness, and that the moment was near. He filled the night with obscenities. He swore at Tsotsi. He was angry and scared. A few minutes later, a few more feet, and he was in the final darkness beyond the last light, and he knew that he had come to the moment and the place for which the young one had waited so patiently the whole night. Now, you and I must think, why would Tsotsi choose Morris? Why would he go after him? And not only go after somebody who doesn't even have legs, but be so persistent and patient in that you would follow him for hours, wait for him to finish eating in the Bantu eating house, come out, and then not just attack him, but kind of stalk him. And he doesn't want the money. So we think to ourselves, well, what is it that he wants? And of course that creates a cliffhanger enough, in a sense, for us to read chapter 7.